Welcome to the Sage Verse, with real works and true words. Patterns of recognition leave your brain converged. Time is irrelevant when the thoughts of impediment corrupt your soul with mind-numbing nemesis. The sage's way is where the truth hits the page. Turn your soul into a library in the name of knowledge and discovery. We seek out reality to be gone of human apathy. Welcome to the Sage Verse, where we explore the pressing questions of our age. My name's Jason, and today I'm joined by a good friend of mine and fellow founder of the channel, Hermes. How are we doing today, man?
Very well, thank you, Jason. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm doing great, thanks. It's the afternoon here at the moment, but
Oh yeah, I suppose morning for me. Jason's in China, I'm in the UK, so
yeah,
different time zones.
doesn't stop us though, hey?
Nah, it doesn't.
So, it's your topic today. I know we've talked about the idea of what we are going to introduce. Do you want to share with the audience what we're going to be bringing?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to be doing an episode today as an introduction to a seven part podcast series, and these 7 parts are going to be discussing the 7 deadly sins. So today's just kind of an overview of those 7 deadly sins as a whole, the idea of sin in that aspect as a whole as well, and then I think it's going to be very interesting to kind of dive deeper into all of those 7 deadly sins.
Exactly, and we tend to talk a lot about virtue and the positive aspects of being a human, so to speak. But it's good to address the other side, right? Vice, sin, however you may call it. So, this series, this episode is just going to be an introduction, as Hermes said. So we're going to give an overview, a brief understanding of what the different sins are, and I suppose we will then extend that in individual series as we go on. So, what do you think about the 7 deadly sins, and how is it relevant to society today? I suppose we can kick things off.
Yeah, so of course, I believe it stems from Christianity, if I'm correct. I've mentioned in previous podcasts in which we've kind of discussed religion in depth, spirituality as well. I was christened when I was young, but I have gone on a spiritual kind of exploration, kind of through different faiths, different spiritual teachings, so I did kind of stray away from Christianity. I'd say I'm still there. I wouldn't identify as a Christian, but with the 7 deadly sins, that's always something I very much related to and found a connection to in my own life as well. The influence towards the partaking of these 7 deadly sins, and the way I feel it negatively impacts my life. And it just seems very, very spot on. It's almost like 7 portals into drawing you downwards into your most animalistic lower self, essentially.
That's my interpretation for sure.
Yeah. And I guess to anyone that doesn't know, just to introduce them, they're usually numbered 1 to 7, starting from pride. As I've heard it explained that without pride, essentially the other 7 deadly sins couldn't exist. It's the beginning of all sin. So again, we can kind of give a deeper overview after. Then greed, which is very prevalent in modern society. Then lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. So, what do you think about the 7 deadly sins?
Just to draw back on what you said about being a kind of portal into our most animalistic tendencies or aspects of our human character that are negative, wholly negative. And then that leads us down to a degree of immorality that punishes us in some sense and enables our suffering on earth. So, as you said, it does originate from Christianity. I believe it was one of the popes. Don't know if it's Pope Gregory or something, but they introduced the 7 cardinal sins, and that they can be rectified by cultivating the the virtues of
7 virtues.
I don't know off the top of my head what they are. I know some of them: humility, charity. So That's an interesting idea, but regarding the verity or how real they feel, those
Mm-hmm.
seven deadly sins, I think that they are just expressions of, the malicious side of humanity.
Mm.
We have things like sloth, greed. These are just the bad symbols, or the almost the symbols of evil in
Mm.
humanity, and they degrade our character to a point that juxtaposes what we could be, i.e., virtuous and righteous,
Mm-hmm.
so to speak. So, the seven deadly sins, they've also been somewhat discovered in other cultures as well before Christianity. Yeah, exactly. Before Christianity, or at least the virtues have also been acknowledged. I know the Greeks, especially the Stoics, they had, the four pillars behind Stoicism, which was justice,
Mm-hmm.
temperance, um,
Mm-hmm.
courage, and wisdom. I have a
Mm-hmm.
series on that if you're not familiar with that already. But
Little plug.
essentially, yeah, a little plug. Essentially, I know that there's two there that are shared: temperance in the Stoics, and also temperance under Christianity, and that idea of self-discipline, and whether or not self-discipline is a way to counteract the vices that may fall on us. So it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting to see how they really impact us. I know that when we think of things like pride, um, you have to have a degree of vision to be able to see, or a degree of foresight to see how the negative consequences could come from that. Because we take things
Mm-hmm.
like pride, which seems almost like an
Almost
innocent.
like a virtue. People see it.
Yeah,
I'd say out of all of them,
you
that's the
should
one
be
that's
proud.
mistaken most for like yeah something positive. Like I'm proud of my children. I'm proud of my life. It's Pride Month. We have a whole month
Mm.
dedicated to Pride. So, what are the consequences of that?
Yeah, it's quite ironic that. So, and it requires a degree of foresight, the ability to understand, I suppose, through reason, how certain actions could turn into, these cardinal sins, such as overeating, right? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
eating too much food and becoming gluttonous, and in reveling
Mm.
reveling in that gluttony, and almost to a point where it becomes unjust. You're not eating a fair amount, you're eating something that is
Mm.
unfair to your human body, and therefore, going down a path that may not benefit you in the future. And then how could that
Yeah.
translate into becoming sloth-like, where we delay what needs to be done, we renounce our responsibilities, and we become, the image of a sloth, which is to laze about and not pursue virtue, essentially. So,
Mm.
the cardinal sins, I think that they embody the manifestations of the highest forms of negative character, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And so you mentioned, just to give the audience the kind of also the heavenly virtues as you
Mm.
brought them up. So yeah, there's the seven deadly sins, and then there's the counterparts of the seven heavenly virtues, which are kind of complete opposites of each. Yeah, each of these sins. So yeah, so I'll start with lust is the deadly sin. The heavenly virtue as its counterpart is chastity,
Mm.
which essentially is yeah, I guess a level of temperance in itself. It's kind of, yeah, not overly indulging in lust. It's like, I guess, taking periods of celibacy, rather than just having sex and connecting with people, that you don't really want a connection with, kind of, saving that
Viewing sex as
for
a
relationships or
yeah.
people you care about, relationships, marriage, I suppose in a Christian sense. Then gluttony, as you just mentioned, the kind of overindulgence in kind of life itself, really. But yeah, it's often compared to food. There are loads of people starving in the world, and then in the West we have the highest obesity rate. There's definitely kind of some kind of unbalance there for that to happen. The counterpart for that is temperance, which is, yeah, just managing what your actions are, in regards to kind of addictions and, kind of craving, doing things you want rather than what you need, overindulging in wants rather than your needs. And in a money sense, greed, for example, we do live in a capitalist society where greed is very prevalent.
Mm.
The counterpart for that is charity, giving to those less fortunate than ourselves. There's a benefit, there's a positive feeling, even if it's just, an increase in self-worth of how you see yourself in partaking in that, but of course also helping other people, the positive impact that has. And then with sloth, you have the counterpart of diligence, which is again chasing after your dreams, really pushing yourself day by day to be productive, to improve yourself with every working day. And wrath, I suppose the counterpart of that is patience.
Yep.
So taking that time, I guess it's a very impulsive thing, anger and wrath. It's like, it's usually, for myself anyway, usually when I feel my patience is wearing thin, that's when I'm most susceptible to getting angry or falling into that trap. So the virtue is the practice of patience, the increasing of your patience. And then with envy, it's kind of linked to jealousy, I suppose, of other people, wanting what other people have. There's the counterpart is kindness. And then lastly, pride. The counterpart is humility. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess humbleness. So
Interesting.
what's kind of comes to mind with those two comparisons of each one?
Those polar opposites make it feel intimately real. But I suppose what sprung to mind right there when you mentioned about wrath and the call to anger, it just reminded
Mm,
me of a Marcus Aurelius quote. I don't know it verbatim, but it goes along the lines of calmness and patience is superior to anger because it is far more human like, and therefore, for that reason, more virtuous or more righteous. Because if we
mm-hmm,
take something like anger and we apply it to human beings, it's the foregoing of reason and the state of carrying out a emotional action or an instinctual action, similar to how you see animals respond when they see something, right? So
mm-hmm,
patience and calmness or peacefulness is almost like the embodiment of what a human can be if they cultivate their mind and analyze a situation rather than being wrath like or angry. You could say that anger or wrath, the excessive use of it, is in some sense to behave beast like, to behave like an animal, right? And
mm,
to take on action in a very destructive way, take on that emotion, anger in a destructive way, rather than to find that serenity or that calmness through controlling oneself, controlling one's emotions, and understanding the
mm,
situation. And yeah, Marcus Aurelius mentioned that it's more human-like to forego anger and adopt the calms. And I suppose
mm-hmm,
that really touches on the idea of anger being or wrath. Wrath is stronger than anger. It's
mm.
it's almost like anger and bloodthirstiness all put into one, right?
Yeah, it's like powerful anger. It's like really snapping. Everyone's had that moment, I'm sure,
Yeah,
where they've just
it's
kind of snapped. Their patience
all
is
reason
wore thin, almost
foregoes.
like a fuse, and then bang.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fuse, and then there's always a destructive output.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, as we said, we're going to kind of dive in the episodes. We're not going to go too deep into each one, is that we're going to really dive deep. It's just kind of an overview. So, I suppose sin as a whole, like understanding
Mm,
what that idea of sin is. I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this before. I believe the word actually means to miss one's mark. So, as you
okay.
mentioned, the they're very linked to the body and the animalistic self. Uh, if you look at that idea, animalistic, what separates us from the animals is, our mind and our connection with self, self being self-conscious and having kind of a purpose and a direction that we can stray, a free will. And things are often compared in a biblical sense to heaven and earth. if we also have a connection to that. I suppose our earthly self is the body, our heavenly self is the soul. And often there's a pulling between those two things. There's, for
Mm.
example, our soul wants us to be the healthiest we can be and wants us to train and push ourselves to look the best we can, to feel the best we can. And then there's the body that just sometimes just wants to eat and wants to be lazy and just wants to sit on the couch and eat donuts and just mindlessly entertain yourself. What's going on there? Why do we have this one side that really wants to strive towards greatness, and then this other side that's kind of pulling us back to
It's
just
fighting an
doing
uphill
pleasurable
battle. That's
bodily
the
things? Yeah, I think that's the pull between the body and the soul. And yeah, it's almost like we do have this animalistic self, and when we are drawn down, in a Hindu sense, they have the chakras.
mm.
As the higher you rise through your energetic, different seven. There are also seven different states of consciousness. The first is the root. The first three are actually the root, which is all about survival, which is linked to, I guess, to gluttony, and yeah, just that kind of staying alive. Then this next is the sacral, which is all about lust and sex, and the third, so it's kind of I'd say the first three are the lower chakras, is all about power.
It's almost
And
yeah.
yeah, if you're drawn into a state of survival, think if you're like thrown in a state of survival, you're not going to be worried about love or rising due to
No, of
infinite
course not.
consciousness or all these things. You're
You're
just
very
drawn
grounded
into your
in that
body.
reality.
Exactly, you're grounded into your body because you're fearing for your survival. And a lot of people are in their everyday lives. They don't have enough money for their bills or for things. So they don't have, essentially they feel like they're trapped in this state of survival to hustle, to work. And, that almost locks you into your animalistic self. But essentially to rise out of that is also the solution and the true way out of it. So it's a bit of a catch-22.
Well, it's funny because it's almost like our souls are not made for our bodies, almost, in the sense that they try to rise out of what cannot be risen out of because we are, human earthly bodies. But the
Mm-hmm.
soul, what is the appetite? What is the appetite of the soul is very different to
Mm-hmm.
the appetite of the body. So how do they? How do
So
the
true.
two? How do the two live in harmony? Right? Where is the balance found?
Well, they don't a
Is
lot
that
of
a
the time.
possibility? Exactly. They don't. But that is the process of human suffering. That battle between
Mm.
the wants of the soul to flourish and preserve, and the wants of the body, which are contradictory, and that is that contradiction which exists, whether we like it or not, and it's not something we can control. But the idea that the soul is not almost designed for our body, I suppose, goes in line with the argument that where we are today on Earth perhaps is not the place where we should be. I don't know about that,
So
but
true. I remember I read a quote. It's something like discipline your mind and your body will follow. So I think it does start there. The starting with your consciousness, you have to really have that level of self-discipline. And yeah, essentially it needs to be stronger than the pulling towards pleasure. That's it.
yeah,
It
the
is
mind needs to
almost
rule
like
the
a
body for sure.
pull. But I mean, being away, like if you're constantly, take lust for example, if you are watching porn every day, or like you're kind of every day you go out, you're checking out girls all around you, you're having a lot of empty sex, you're very much playing with that seven deadly sin. You're connecting with lust. But if you take that moment of chastity, you quit watching porn, you stop wanting empty sex, you realize it doesn't fulfill you, you want something deeper, a loving relationship where you can actually connect with someone deeply. Sometimes that period of celibacy, you will see the lust will begin to fade down. It, like, it almost kills it off when you take that period away from it.
Okay,
So yeah,
but
it kind of makes sense. It's like the more you're enticing and embracing it, the stronger it becomes, the stronger of a hold it has over you. The more you take that step away from it, eventually, in my experience anyway, it does fade.
okay, to play devil's advocate, then what about sex positivity? The idea that
Mhm.
how we view sex should be changed. Modern
Mhm.
society is changing, whether we like it or not. But the
Yeah.
idea is, are we abandoning our alignment with the past virtues that have
Mhm. Yeah. I think to an
created the
extent.
foundations of society, which have now brought us to where we are. And
I will say I like to play the middle, like that law of polarity, find that middle ground. I think I see issue in the past with sex being demonized in a religious
mm,
sense, and I see issue with overly, just playing with it and,
extremes.
you're not seeing it as something valuable at all, because sex ultimately is sacred. The act of sex, the most, the biggest reason for it essentially is the creation of life, uh,
Well,
that
some
that
people
is
would
that is
argue, but yeah.
essentially,
In
well, there
theory,
is
in
a
theory, yeah,
pleasurable
it makes
side.
sense, right?
That is, well, it's a massive part of it at the very least. We do feel pleasure while doing it, so absolutely there is other things to do with it. But to take back to what I see issue with on each side. So in a biblical sense and an ancient sense, there was very much a demonization of sex.
Of course,
And
yeah.
the issue I think that caused is it made it a taboo subject. And I've said this before, if you actually look in the most religious countries and even in America, because you can compare between different states, the most religious states, the actual highest porn use is in the
Yeah.
most religious countries
And
and the
it
most
goes
religious states.
for
And I
sure,
think that's
yeah.
because that's because when you repress something, it's something very natural to us, it's going to come up in unhealthy ways. You're going to learn about it from, the porn industry, which isn't the best place to learn about it from. So I don't think repression is the answer. I don't think demonizing something that
Mm.
comes very natural to us is the answer. But on the vice versa,
Yeah, exactly.
to overly just kind of have sex with kind of everyone and, have a complete, I think sex ultimately is about love. It's
I
about
think it's to
connecting
be
with
at one
someone.
with both. It's to be at one with both and
Yeah.
accepting of both sides of our character because both sides exist, right? The idea
Yeah.
of chastity exists and the idea of lust exists.
Mm-hmm.
You can't remove one. If you remove one, the other doesn't exist, right? Because
Yeah.
there's no comparison. So
Yeah.
the balance is somewhere in the middle.
I always think it's in the middle for sure, and like I said about opposites, things exist usually within the middle of a spectrum. We always want to be drawn towards extremes. I think it's easier to want to be drawn towards extremes, but finding that middle ground is actually the hardest part, and that's usually where balance is to be found. But again, not to dive too much into one, as we're
Yeah,
going to do
exactly.
an individual thing on each one. Uh, what do you think about that idea of, sin in general as missing of a mark? That like when you play bow and arrow, archery, to miss your mark is that's where the word comes from. That's sin.
To
So
slip
what do you
up.
think that means?
To miss your mark, to slip up. I think that there is a difference between conscious sin and
Mm-hmm.
sin that we are not aware of. Because arguably, the sin that we are not aware of, is slip. Well, it's difficult to interpret that saying that it's missing your mark. I think that sinning is where you know you've done something wrong,
Mm.
where you can actually you'll harbor guilt to some degree. You can hide
Because
away
sometimes it's
sin.
not conscious.
Yeah, exactly. It's
So,
not
for
conscious,
example, say
but
that the kid that is offered porn by a friend, and he doesn't necessarily know in that moment
well,
it's a
that's a
bad
lack
thing
of
to do.
knowledge then, right?
Yeah, but
All
then by
vices.
partaking in it, the guilt still comes up. No one's ever watched porn and not checked the door or like felt guilty afterwards, or like no one would be happy with their parent walking in on them, doing
Yeah,
that.
it'd be
So
shameful, right? So that
yeah,
degree of shame brings a certain degree of truth to the room at the end of the day.
mm-hmm,
Because if there was no shame, then there's nothing. Then arguably there's nothing wrong. But the fact that shame exists means that something embarrassing has taken place. And what is the
mm-hmm,
source of that embarrassment? Is that embarrassment socially misplaced? Have we
mm.
emplaced this kind of embarrassment
Yeah.
and
My
or
question to
as
you
a,
is,
as
do
a
you do
as a
you think
social
that's
construct? Yeah,
Do
go
you
on.
think that shame arises naturally, or do you think it's
Haha.
linked to what I said about, we are coming off thousands of years of like religious control and control and laws and the way we kind of operate in everyday society. So sex was very much
I'll tell
something
you
that's
what
very
I think.
taboo.
I'll tell you
Yeah,
what
so
I think.
I personally do think that that's linked to, it becoming a taboo has made it uncomfortable. Some parents never talk
Oh,
about
what
sex
you
with their
think that
children,
that
or the
is?
exploration of pleasure and the body and things like that. And that lack of not wanting to talk about is also what's made us have a negative relationship to it. I'd argue that. What do you think?
Well, what I think is that for every social construct that exists, there has to be a natural cause or a natural dependent. And I think that we have a degree of privacy over our bodies
Mm-hmm.
before we socially construct, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
We're not like animals that if you just leave naked, automatically don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
As far as I think intuitively, right?
Mm-hmm.
It seems very intuitive that if you strip someone naked, you know, that's been isolated from society and has grown up on an island for, I don't know, up until the age of 7, 8, where they're able to reason a little bit, um,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, and you have people running around unconsciously, without clothes, and there's no shame. It's interesting. It's an interesting anthropological topic to consider, how
Mm-hmm.
societies develop, and I'm sure there are, arguments for both sides, and there's a combination of the two. And I think
Mm-hmm.
what distinguishes it is the presence of reason to some degree, because
Mm.
you could argue that virtue, or what we understand to be virtuous, is a strange kind of knowledge. I know Socrates put forward the idea that it could be divine knowledge, something that is
Mm-hmm.
superior to what we understand normally.
Mm-hmm.
And if it is information that pertains to something divine or something soul like, then maybe there are individuals who have ideas that relate to the concepts of virtues and vice, and that perhaps it doesn't arise naturally in every case, and that there would
Mm.
be circumstances and instances where you would have societies completely desensitized from the concept of shame, being clothed, and to take the bare example of what that feels like, um,
Mm.
because it's kind of a
Well, just
shock
to, if I
factor.
could jump in, I'll
Yeah,
let you
go on.
finish your point.
No, go on,
Well,
jump in.
just because you mentioned the nudity side, and yeah, it's interesting because if you take it back to original sin, even in the Bible with Adam and Eve, they were living, naked in the Garden of Eden
Well,
without
yeah,
being,
I was going to
conscious, or
mention
that
that.
was just something very, normal and natural. And then once they ate from the tree of knowledge, is it?
Yep.
They essentially became self-conscious, self-aware, like realized they were naked, and that drew them off in that direction. But if we're also going to compare, say, religious societies that did exist with Christianity, and then maybe some tribes that didn't, for example, they very much live in the jungle with just like loincloths, or women like kind of just bare-breasted. And that's something that's quite natural, living at one with nature, with your
Like, I
body.
think there's a degree of desensitization that occurs when it happens over time. I think the issue is, like, the first time Adam and Eve, when they realized that they were
Mm,
naked, that's the first point, right? That degree of shame,
mm-hmm,
that degree of privacy has been overstepped, right?
mm,
It's interesting to see how, societies could definitely become desensitized to the subject, whether or
mm,
not that is, the the natural, or the teleological way of how it would plan out normally. I don't know, but it's hard to really put your finger on. Like I said,
but I think that
you
that could
can't
be
really
linked to
study it.
pride, because they do say pride is the first of all, of the seven deadly
Mm,
sins, and the rest kind of come from it. So I guess, pride, if you're going to look at it in the sense, it's a
proud of one's
separation
body.
between yourself and everything else. And same in the Garden of Eden, you could see it as they were existing kind of as one with the garden. There was no level of separation. Once they ate from the apple, the tree of knowledge, they became very self-aware. There was a separation almost between them and their environment, almost a separation between them and God, or them and the universe, however you want to see it.
Yep.
And that separation is what then led to, the sin that kind of followed. And same with pride. it's painted as like almost a self-love, but I don't think it is. Self-love I think
It's
is
more of
something
a
very
self
different from
glory,
pride.
I would say.
Yeah,
Self
I
glory.
think pride it stems from an insecurity. It's like you're boasting or you're trying to show your aesthetic, as a boasting because I think of a deeper insecurity. Whereas self-love, like you don't really need to boast it. It's something you're just accepting of yourself fully. You don't care necessarily what
Yeah.
other people think. There is no other. If you're truly existing at one with everything, you'll let that kind of occur naturally.
Yeah, as we
Then I
discussed
guess that
previously, it's like self acceptance.
yeah, exactly. That's what I think. And not to it is Pride Month. I'd prefer maybe a self-love month. I think there is definitely a positivity about it, but I also think the wording and there can be a negativity about it as well. As we said, when you stray too far on one side or the other, there can be negatives of each virtue.
Yeah, it's definitely ironic a little bit.
Mm,
But it's difficult to really understand, how these or what the consequences of these sins might be in the future from when they occur.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and the fact that we can't decide on what is a sin or a virtue, or perhaps the human condition is so complex, right, that we no
mm.
longer really try to attribute one thing to being good and one thing to being bad. We live in a relative society, or we live in a relative world at the moment. So
Yeah.
everything is kind of not everything is not labeled, right? It's not mislabeled.
Mm.
It's unlabeled. So
I
with that
think
being
things are quite
said,
backwards in modern society. If you see it as like what's actually happening in the modern world, the amount of pain, the amount of suffering that's all around us that we're very much aware of, and just to kind of compare how each one of these is kind of really accepting, almost glorified in modern society. Lust, absolutely. We boast of each other, how many people we've slept with, almost just like it's a
yeah,
count. The glorification of porn and sex in the kind of media and stuff like that. With gluttony, is very much a level of being body positive right now. Just which I think it's
the
good to
script
have
has been
self acceptance, self
flipped
love.
a
But if
little
you're
bit.
if you're being told if you're being told to just completely accept yourself if you're morbidly obese, and that's fine if that's just how someone wants to live. Well, to be honest, it's not, because you're very much damaging your health. You should absolutely be striving to the best you can be. So to
Well,
have this idea of just
I tell you
accepting
what it
gluttony,
is.
or again greed as well. We just want to fully accept that idea of how much money, or who has the best cars, and that comparison of how much money you have. Sloth, there's very much a big Netflix and entertainment culture, like Netflix and chill, like that
Yeah,
idea.
we can tackle those for sure. I'm just want to jump in and say that what we're seeing is the fear of virtue.
Mm,
We're
mm-hmm,
seeing the fear of standards is what we're seeing. And what I
mm-hmm,
mean by that is that what is arguably ideal, or what could be as a natural, not even natural, but as a positive force for good, and a a positive expression of how you could be as an excellent human, is virtue, and that's the highest good, the highest form. We're seeing a
mm-hmm,
fear of that, almost as if it's unattainable. And that fear translates to an acceptance of sin, an acceptance of vice almost, or an
mm-hmm,
acceptance of unideal states, the enabling of weakness, right? The
mm-hmm,
enabling of, which arguably is a degree of self acceptance, but there's a difference between accepting things that are beyond one's control and enabling things that could be readily improved if the mind
mm-hmm,
were in a position to do so, right? You don't have to be all accepting of things that can be improved.
mm-hmm.
If they can be improved, they should be, because that's
Do you
cultivating
think?
virtue.
Do you think that this is naturally occurring in modern society, or do you think there's an elite force that are drawing the population based on what's shown in the media, shown around them, that they essentially want to invoke these seven deadly sins in humanity?
That's the $1 million question. Um, well, perhaps we can discuss that for another episode.
That's a good way to end it. Okay, cool. I enjoyed this. Again, it's difficult because I really want to dive deeper into each one, but the essence and the idea of this episode is just an overview and introduction of that's what we are going to do. So look out for those next 7 episodes. I suppose number 1 is Pride, so the next episode we'll really dive into Pride, and it is Pride Month, so I guess we could talk a bit about that as well. And yeah, is there anything you want to say, Jason?
Nothing. Spread the love. Peace.
All right, peace out, guys.
Welcome to the Sageverse. Please just observe the birth of this creative surge for the purpose to leave hatred purged and replaced with words that will make you learn to take your place on earth. And once you've taken your place and found your greatest of traits, cultivated the day, this will be making you say, this is the Sage's way.